Hello, guys. Today we're going to be introducing quite a different type of topic. We're kind of moving away from Nietzsche and that kind of series, which we'll be covering more of Nietzsche and a few of his other books. But today we're going to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was a very, very interesting philosopher. He believed that he solved all the philosophy. Until the realization later on in his life, after the Tractatus, that actually, he had a little bit. I guess he had some things that were wrong. Now, it all starts really with his idea of language and how language is like when it comes to language and world, that it seems, like in the way that they relate, it's like a picture, which is very interesting, and it goes all the way back to Augustine, and he basically said there was this Augustinian picture of language. Now, when you look at Augustine's philosophy of language and science, I think his philosophy of language occupies a very distinctive position in the history of ideas, because he draws upon the Stoic-influenced kind of Hellenistic and Roman grammatical theories, but he also introduces, these original contributions that he has. Now, following the Stoics, Augustine distinguishes between the sound of a word, right, its meaning, and the thing it signifies. And this is a famous distinction, from Sextus Empiricus in Adversus Mathematicos. Now, Augustine appears to have been the first thinker to interpret language as a unified system of science, and to kind of embed it within a comprehensive general semiotic kind of theory. Now, if you read De Doctrina Christina, Augustine, what he does is he divides reality into things and signs. Now, for him, signs are the things that, beyond their own being, point to something else. And he further distinguishes natural or involuntary signs, right, such as smoke, that might signify fire. Now, you have voluntary signs, right, or given signs, which include language. And language is thus defined as a system of given signs through which a speaker signifies things, or thoughts, or emotions. Now, within the theological framework of De Doctrina Christina, right, the ultimate referent of scriptural signs is God, right, himself. And Augustine accordingly grounds his hermeneutics in the criterion of love, the love of God and neighbour, as this kind of standard of correct biblical interpretation. Now, external signs, including the words of scripture, function on a lower ontological level than the inward signs, right? These inward intelligible truths, because they attempt to kind of convey. And genuine knowledge ultimately transcends signs altogether, right? In a direct grasp of things. Now, this principle extends even to the sacraments and the incarnation of Christ, as Augustine argues, right, in his Contra Epistolam Fundamente. Right, and so at least the most concentrated treatment of language does appear in an early dialogue in De Mastrigio, right, where Augustine kind of investigates whether words can teach us anything. And after this kind of analysis of how verbal signs relate to things and to other signs, he begins to kind of arrive at this conclusion that we do not in fact learn things from signs, because understanding a sign already presupposes acquaintance with that, with it, what it kind of signifies. And this is very interesting to the paradox of inquiry, like an epistemic paradox. It goes to the Meno in Plato, and Augustine kind of resolves it through the doctrines of the inner teacher and illumination, right, which is like a Neoplatonic reinterpretation, right, of Platonic anamnesis. Now, words still remain useful, but they alert us to things beyond direct experience, and, well, crucially, they kind of prompt us to consult the inner teacher and come to understanding ourselves. Now, in the later books of De Trinitate, Augustine begins to develop the concept of the inner word, using it to kind of illuminate the relationship between the divine Logos and Christ incarnate. So just as a spoken word expresses an inner concept, in the same way Christ signifies and communicates the divine word, and the inner word is generated by actualizing latent knowledge stored in memory, right? And, it's non-linguistic in character. It's not Greek, it's not Latin, it's not Hebrew, but it's an atemporal intellectual insight that exceeds language entirely. And so in this sense, Augustine's theory of the inner word ultimately just points beyond linguistics altogether. Now, the interesting thing about Wittgenstein, right, is his critique of an Augustinian picture of language. Now, Wittgenstein opens his philosophical investigations by quoting a passage from Augustine Hippo's Confessions, right, in order to introduce what he takes to be a pervasive and mistaken picture of linguistic meaning, namely that the meanings of words are the objects for which those words stand. And Wittgenstein kind of summarizes this Augustinian picture of two related claims. First, the individual words in language name objects, and sentences are these kind of combinations of such names. And the second thing is that the meaning of a word is the object for which it stands. Now, if you go to the precise structure of Wittgenstein's critique, you kind of can argue that understanding it requires to distinguish these two claims. And an apparent tension arises early in the philosophical investigations, in the part 7, where Wittgenstein himself speaks of a learner, right, naming objects during language instructions, which seems to kind of endorse the very picture he's criticizing. Now, I think you can kind of get around this by arguing that Wittgenstein's critique is directed primarily at the second claim, right, that a word's meaning just is its referent, rather than the weaker kind of more obvious first claim that some words do name objects. Now, in the section 7, it only asserts the latter. In numerous passages throughout the philosophical investigations, while they're confirming that Wittgenstein had no intention of denying that naming is a genuine linguistic phenomenon, what he rejects is the further move of identifying the named object, right, with the word's meaning as such. And so to clarify what Wittgenstein puts in place of the Augustinian picture, you can draw on several key passages. So, namely, if you look at section 10 in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, he asks what the words of the primitive language signify. And he answers that what they signify is shown by the kind of use they have. Now, if you also go to section 43, he kind of offers this, this formulation, right, that for a large class of cases, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. And the point is not that the reference plays no role in meaning, but that it's only one element within a far richer and more complex structure of the word use. So just as in the Aristotelian framework, matter and form can be conceptually distinguished, right, but not separated in reality, right? So too, the object involved in the word's use and the use itself are distinguishable in analysis, but inseparable in practice. And Wittgenstein, funnily enough, devotes special attention to proper names, right? If you read 40 to 42, right? Since these are the most tempting cases for the Augustinian view. Now, the bearer of a proper name might seem, obviously, to constitute its meaning, but Wittgenstein points out in, section 40, that confusing a name's meaning with its bearer leads to absurdity, right? When a person dies, we say the bearer of the name dies, not the meaning dies. And moreover, fictional proper names have perfectly functioning place in language games, despite having no bearer at all, which shows that meaningful use does not necessarily depend on the reference to any existing object. Now, I think the deeper point that Wittgenstein's kind of getting at and that we can draw out is that the Augustinian picture does not merely make a claim about the individual words, right? It offers a complete theory of what language fundamentally is, right? Treating it, this reference to worldly elements as the kind of primary source from which language derives all its content and meaning. Now, obviously, Wittgenstein has this counter-vision, right, that language is first and foremost a form of human behaviour, right, it's a form of life, and that meaning kind of arises from participation in practices of use, rather than from any prior act of correlating words with objects. And so he doesn't deny the face value truth that some words name objects, but he's just firmly resisting, treating this as the essence, so to speak, of human language. And this is a very good kind of way to put it. We begin to understand, what is going on, right, when, we're speaking about this. Now, I guess the interesting thing is that he gets into things like private language. Now, private language is a little bit different. When you kind of look into the philosophical investigations a bit more thoroughly, it's one of the most celebrated and contested arguments in the history of philosophy, right? there's kind of a widespread disagreement about how we actually, or exactly, this argument kind of works, which a lot of the sections of the investigations constitute it, and even whether Wittgenstein was offering arguments in any conventional sense, right? But the argument must be understood in context, right? Much of this, much of the philosophical investigations that he's writing is an extended attack on what, he calls the Augustinian picture of language, like we were speaking about before. Now, I guess, to give you more clarity and more context, the structure of the argument, broadly speaking, is a reductio. So if the Augustinian picture of language and mind is correct, then private language, right, a language whose words refer intrinsically, right, to private experiences inaccessible to anybody else, should be possible. But obviously, that's not possible. Now, there is a couple of, examples of what private language is. Now, before obviously any argument can proceed and kind of go along and get to its conclusion, right, Wittgenstein specifies what a private language is, right? It's one whose individual words refer to only what can be known to the person speaking, to that person's immediate private sensations, such that no other person could in principle understand it. And this isn't empathetically, right, it's empathetically not just a language, right, somebody has invented, or they're just using it for personal use without sharing it, right? It's more of like a personal code, right? However, when you elaborate, right, it could be in principle be communicated to another person, but its terms are defined by reference to public objects or to words in an already existing public language. Now, another person could learn the code, so to speak, if they had the given key. Right. Similarly, there's nothing problematic about private thoughts or inner speech or diaries that you might not show to anybody. All these could be principled, be translated as an ordinary public language. But a genuinely private language, right, by contrast, is one whose terms are defined entirely by reference to the speaker's inner experience, without connection to anything publicly observable. So even if another person watched the speaker's every behaviour and heard everything that they said, they could gain no foothold for translation because their reference, right, are inaccessible in principle. So the words get their meaning through this kind of inner pointing, right? The speaker directs attention to a sensation and attaches a symbol to it. And this is what the Augustinian picture of mental language accounts to, right? And this is what Wittgenstein argues is incoherent. Now, Wittgenstein introduces a thought experiment, right, to look at private language directly. So suppose a person regularly experiences a certain sensation and decides to record its occurrence in a diary, right? And they write the symbol S. And each time the sensation reoccurs, right? Now, the person cannot define S in terms, drawn from any public language, because to do so would make it translatable and therefore it's not private. Instead, S is given meaning ostensively. So the person concentrates attention on the sensation, right, and directs attention inwardly, and thereby establishes, as it were, a connection between the sign and the sensation. And this procedure is meant to be analogous to how public ostensive definition works. Like if I point to a glass and say, gulp, right, I seem to be giving a name to something, the glass, or its colour, or its shape, or the type of object it is. But Wittgenstein just wants to say, well, that public ostensive definition only works against a background of established linguistic practice. So to understand gulp as the name of a type of glass rather than a colour or a proper noun requires already knowing the grammar of naming. So the distinction between types and tokens and all these other things, right? So the pointing itself undermines or kind of underdetermines the meaning, right? And so you need to set the stage. That's required. So the same problem arises for S, but more severely, right? The inner pointing that is supposed to establish the meaning of S lacks even the minimal context that public pointing provides, right? Nothing about concentrating attention on sensation determines how the symbol is to be used on future occasions. Now, one of the big interpretations of the argument, right, the central problem kind of concerns memory and the absence of independent criterion for correct use. So suppose on Monday I experience a sensation and I label it S, right? And on Thursday I experience another sensation that seems the same, right? So I write S again. How do I know the Thursday sensation is the same type as Monday's, right? All I have is my memory and my feeling, right, that is the same. There's no independent thing that I can check on, right? So in public language, this problem doesn't arise in the same way, right? Because if S, right, names a colour or an object type, right, Other speakers can correct my memory, right? I might call something S on a Thursday, and I might be told that, by these other people, well, that's not S. You've just kind of misremembered. Now, the community provides an external standard against, right, which any individual's use can be assessed. And so your memory remains fallible for everybody, but the reports of different people can be checked against one another. And now in private language, you can't have that type of correction. Nobody else can see what S is and what it's supposed to label. So my own memory is the only thing that can guide me, right? And kind of thinking about my further memories, right? So I guess, as Wittgenstein says, like buying several copies of the same newspaper to confirm what it reports. Whatever feels right to me is simply right. And that, Wittgenstein concludes, means that there is no genuine distinction between correct and incorrect use. And so without that distinction, S is not a word following a rule, right? It's actually just not even a word. Now, I guess there's another interpretation of the argument associated with people like, Mary McGinn. And she locates the problem not at the level of memory, but at the level of initial naming, right? So the issue isn't that S loses its meaning over time through memory failure, right? It's that S never acquired any meaning in the first place. And so Wittgenstein, says that naming a sensation supposes a great deal of stage setting in language. So consider the analogy of electrical brain stimulation, right? And it's causing a person to reliably produce a certain noise. Now, even if the noise infallibly, accompanies a particular brain state, well, this doesn't make the noise the same, the same like name for a sensation, right? Something more is needed, right? It's a grammatical role, right? A place in a practice, a technique of, employing it in a sense. Now, the problem with private ostensive definition is that the inner pointing cannot supply this, right? When I point to, a glass and I say gulp, well, yeah, the meaning, like I said before, is indeterminate. And so it's not really working, right? It could be a different type of thing. And so even framing the scenario as one involving the naming of a sensation, we already rely on public grammar of sense, vocabulary, words like sensation or name or same that belong to ordinary language and then kind of carry on its criterion with them. Now, to kind of explain this very, very simply, all he's saying is the Augustinian picture of language supposes private language, and private language is false. Now, the easiest kind of thing that we can kind of show private language is something that's faulty is if I say, for example, right, I have a box, right, and within this box, I have something called beetle, and I only know, right, what this beetle is in my box. Now, everybody has the same box as me, and they all just say whatever's in their box is called beetle, right? When I think of beetle, right, let's say I don't know what this other guy's got in his box, right, but he does. And I say, oh, do you have a beetle in your box? And he's like, yeah, I do have a beetle in my box. And then he asked me the same question, do you have a beetle in your box? And I'm like, yeah, I do have a beetle in a box. Now, either or would never be able to know what that beetle actually truly is. Yeah, they have the same name, right? But they wouldn't necessarily have the same referent. Right, they wouldn't know what either or reference is. They'd only know their own referent. And so the thing is that Wittgenstein is trying to say is that language is always communal. Right, to have a real fleshed out language, you need it to be communal within a community, right, to be plugged in. Right, and so private language is really faulty in that sense too.